Good morning, boys and girls. Today I'm going to be reading you a story called Lucky Beans by Becky Bertha, and it's illustrated by Nicole Tadgell. This book is based around the time of the Great Depression, which we talked a little bit about that when we were studying the presidents. The Great Depression, Herbert Hoover was president at that time, and it's when all the stock markets crashed and people lost their jobs, businesses went out of business, people were staying home, didn't have money for food. And one of the things that they ate a lot of back then were beans because they were a cheaper food and very nutritious, so it would fill you up and you didn't have to eat a lot of it. This story is based on this little boy and his grandmother. During the time, she would make beans every single night for dinner and just use different recipes so it never got old, and they felt like they were eating something new and different every day. After the Great Depression, Herbert Hoover did not get reelected, but one of our presidents that we talked about a lot, FDR, Franklin D. Roosevelt, became president, and he was the first president to talk to the American people over radio and tell them what was happening and how he was going to help them. So just cold wind ripped through Marshall Loman's old wool jacket. The snow froze his toes right through his hand-me-down boots. He ran up the steps into the steamy kitchen. "What's for dinner, Ma? I'm starving." Look how cold it looks. I've never seen that much snow before. We can probably tell from this picture that he does not live in Houston or Texas, I bet. He's got to probably live somewhere up north, maybe New York, Oregon. Some are cold. Look at the picture. We have a pot of something cooking. Here's his mom, maybe. Little girl in the background. "Get those boots off and hang your coat up," Ma said without looking around. "And I don't want to hear any complaints about dinner." But Marshall had already peeked into the big pot. "Beans? Again? Aw, Mom, can't we ever have anything else?" "Yes, it's beans again, and we're lucky to have them. So get washed on the double and then set the table." Marshall didn't feel so lucky. The elbows of his jackets were worn almost all the way through. Dad had been out of work for months, and there was no money. The house was crowded since Aunt Minnie and Uncle Matt moved in. Now Marshall had to share a room with his little brother and sister, Tommy and Patsy. And he was starting to hate beans. After dinner, when Ma pulled out her mending basket, Marshall showed her his worn-out jacket. Dad turned on the radio. "President Roosevelt's going to speak tonight," he said. "Maybe he's found a way to get America out of this mess we're in." Marshall was halfway through his homework when the president came on the radio. He didn't understand all the big words, but he knew Mr. Roosevelt was on the poor people's side. On the way to school the next morning, Marshall and Tommy trudged past Kaplan's furniture store. Whenever Marshall helped Ma carry groceries home, she would stop to look at the shining sewing machine in the window. "Only $23.95, the sign had said. That was $23.95 that Ma would never have. Today, alongside the sewing machine, was the biggest jar of beans he had ever seen. There was a different sign. "How many beans are in the jar? Win this brand new sewing machine." "How many beans they got in there, Marshall?" Tommy pulled on Marshall's sleeve. 100? 1,000? "How should I know?" Marshall answered. But he was thinking, "I know somebody who would know." So there's a contest going on. If you can guess how many beans are in this large jar, the person closest or the person who gets it right wins the sewing machine. So as you can see, there's a lot of people in line right here with their number. Putting it in here, all making guesses. On the way home, Marshall looked through the store window again. Ladies were writing on little cards of paper and pushing them through a slot into a big box. That night, after Ma checked his homework, Marshall told her about the contest. The next day, when Marshall and Tommy got home, Ma said, "I went to the furniture store today." She was cooking beans again. "Did you enter the contest?" "Not so fast. I need a little more time to chew it over." "Aren't you going to complain about having beans?" Ma joked. Marshall shook his head. "I figure the more you know about beans, the better." So she says, "I need a little more time to chew it over." Does that really mean she's going to put it in her mouth and chew it like you would a piece of gum? No. When she's saying, "I need a little more time to chew it over," that's a saying for she just needs a little more time to think it over. Think about it. I wonder what he's doing over here. Looks like he's getting a jar. He has some jars right here. I wonder what he's doing. That night's homework was a page of arithmetic problems. We've talked about what the word arithmetic means. Remember, that's math. So that night's homework was a page of math problems. How many cups are in a pint? Marshall knew the answer. 2. How many pints are in a quart? Ma was looking over his shoulder. "Boy, don't you know how many pints fit in a quart?" she asked. "Go down in the cellar and fetch me an empty pint jar." In the cellar, Ma kept food she had canned from Dad's garden. There were more empty jars than full ones. Last winter, when Ma sent them to fetch something, he and Tommy would snitch a pickle from the big crock at the foot of the stairs. Now the pickle crock was empty too. Ma showed him how to fill up the small pint jar with water and pour it into the empty quart milk bottle to measure it. 2 pints filled the quart, so 4 cups made a quart. After school the next day, Marshall saw a new sign in Mr. Kaplan's window. "Only 2 days left to make your guess." Kids were standing around. "Our Ma's going to win the sewing machine," Tommy piped up. "Your Ma?" Agnes, a girl in Marshall's class, whirled around to face Tommy. "They won't let your mama win. Only white ladies can win contests." Tommy shouted back, "That's not true." Then he turned to Marshall. "Is it?" Marshall grabbed his brother's hand and marched him to the store. "Come on, Tommy. We're going to find out." "Well, young man, what can I do for you?" Mr. Kaplan said to Marshall. "I have a question about the sewing machine contest rules. Can anybody win? Or can only white ladies win?" Mr. Kaplan took his glasses off and looked Marshall in the eye. "Anybody can win the contest," he said. "This is America. It will be fair." When Marshall and Tommy got home, Ma was cooking potatoes and cabbage, but 5 sacks of beans sat on the kitchen table. "Where'd all those beans come from?" Marshall asked. "Oh, the church ladies and neighbors. After dinner, I want you boys to help me count them. But run down to the cellar now, Marshall, and fetch me a pint jar of tomatoes." Out of habit, Marshall checked the pickle crock before starting back upstairs. Of course, it was still empty. But Marshall stopped in his tracks. The pickle crock, he was sure of it, was the same size as that big jar of beans. They could count how many beans fit into the pickle crock. Then Ma would know the right number. That's very smart. After dinner, Dad lugged the pickle crock up into the kitchen. They all crowded around counting beans from the sacks and dumping them into the crock. The last bean was number 4,341. But the 4,341 beans didn't fill much of the crock. Ma peered in. Well, she said, the sign did say guess. I reckon that's what we'll have to do. So of all the beans that they only had 4,341 beans, but they said it didn't even fill up much of the pot. Okay, so just a little bit of the pot. That's 4,341 beans. Before we move on, I want you guys to stop right now. And in your head, I want you to take a guess of how many beans you think would fill up a pot this big. If we know that only 4,341 beans fill up just a little bit like this, think of a good number that you think would fill up the whole pot. I'm going to give you a couple seconds to think about that. Everybody have their number? Okay. Then Marshall remembered something from school. His class was finished with measuring, and now they were learning estimating. It's better than guessing, Miss Dover had said. Use what you already know to solve the problem. Marshall said, Ma, I know. Let's count how many beans fit in a quart jar and how many quarts of water fill up the crock. Then we can multiply beans times quarts to estimate the number of beans. Ma grinned at him. Now you're cooking with gas, she said. When they were finished counting and multiplying, they had the number Ma thought was right. 53,280 beans. All right, here it is, the store. He's about to reveal how many beans are in the pot, in the jar. There's a nice fancy sewing machine. On Saturday morning, Mr. Kaplan's furniture store was full of people. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Kaplan announced, we had 327 entries, and today we have a winner. First, let's reveal how many beans are in the jar. Okay, does everybody have their idea and their number that they guessed? Let's see. He unscrewed the lid and showed the number marked inside. 53,293. Marshall heard gasps and whistle. Holy mackerel, somebody said. Marshall's heart was thumping hard. Ma's guess was so close. Was she going to win? Mr. Kaplan went on. One guess was off by only 13 beans. And the winner, who guessed 53,280 beans, is Mrs. Josephine Lohman from 7234 Monticello Street. Ma, that's you! Marshall threw his arms around his mother's waist. Congratulations, Mrs. Lohman. Mr. Kaplan shook Ma's hand. After Ma won the sewing machine, everything got a little better. Ma was sewing up a storm and getting paid for it too. Dad got part-time work helping Mr. Kaplan with the deliveries. The only thing that wasn't so good was the other prize Ma won. That jar of beans seemed even bigger in Ma's kitchen than it had in Mr. Kaplan's store. To Marshall, it looked like a lifetime supply. Guess they'll be having beans for years. I want some beans. The end. Lucky.